Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Am I too loud? No, okay, thank you. I am Lee Friedman, and it was my pleasure to serve during the time of Geno Smolensky's deanship as the Goldman School's first academic associate dean. I had already been on the Berkeley faculty for about 15 years when I first met Geno Smolensky. It was in 1988, to the best of my memory. He was one of the finalist positions then, finalist for the position of the dean at our school. He was interviewing on campus, and I, with a few other GSPP colleagues, had dinner with him at the faculty club. After dinner, I walked with him back to his hotel, only about a block away from where we are right now. He wasn't tired. He hadn't seen much of Berkeley. The weather was good, so we decided to walk around a bit. And we walked down Durant Avenue toward Telegraph. I thought he might like seeing the famous bookstores that were there then, like Cody's and Moe's, and University Press books, some of Berkeley's street life. Then we might mosey over to Sproul Plaza, see Zellerbach Hall, see the plaza itself, famous for the free speech movement of the 1960s. But as we got within a block of Telegraph, we heard loud yelling of a crowd and the sound of glass breaking. And I realized that this would not be a good visiting time for those areas. And I whirled him around to return him safely to his hotel. Since I considered it my job to present Berkeley in its best light, I was miserable, and I expected that we would lose this fine candidate. But Gene never wavered in his interest in us. He was raised in Brooklyn, seasoned himself by seeing somewhat similar events on the Madison campus of the University of Wisconsin. He was tough, and he was not easily deterred. He was also very smart, a great leader, a great academic, a great person, and he became our third dean. That interview day in 1988 was the start of our 35-year friendship, and I miss sorely today his wisdom as well as his wit. Our speakers today will tell you more about Geno and his impact on all of us. First, I would like to thank all of those who helped to create this memorial. David Wilson, Dean of the Goldman School, thank you so much for providing the school's support. And Henry Brady, thank you for thinking through the memorial with me and developing its plans. GSPP administrators and staff, especially Sandy Ketchpel, Bora Reed, and Lo DeGendre, were instrumental in making and publicizing the memorial. Thank you. Thank you also to Geno's family, many of whom are with us today, for coordinating with us as we planned two different events. There was this cemetery service this morning and this memorial. Could I ask Geno's family members to kindly stand just for a moment and raise your hand when I call your name? Because later on, others here will want to share memories of Geno with you, and this will help them to do so. So would you, if you could, please stand for the moment. Geno's son, Paul, and Paul's wife, Geraldine Legendre. Geno's grandson, Josh, in the back. Josh's two daughters, Chloe and Claire. Geno's great-granddaughters. Geno's nephews, Matt Rabin, and Dan Rabin. Thank you. Geno's daughter, Beth Smolensky, and his granddaughter-in-law, Megan Smolensky, could not be with us today, but if you are listening on the live stream, we are thinking of you as well. And finally, thank you to all of our speakers, some of whom have traveled across the country, for agreeing to share their thoughts about and experiences with Geno. good remembrances to help us with the sadness of his passing. At the conclusion of this memorial, all here are welcome to partake in some light refreshments in the back of the room, share your memories of Geno with each other. Without further ado, let us turn to our speakers in the order shown in the program. Our first speaker is Chancellor Carol Christ. Carol began as Chancellor in 2017, but she has a long history as a UC Berkeley faculty member and administrator. In particular, she was the Vice Chancellor and Provost of the university from 1994 to 1998, years of substantial overlap with Geno Smolensky's deanship. Please welcome Chancellor Carol Christ.
I'm honored to speak about Gene Smolensky, an extraordinary scholar, a transformational dean of the Goldman School, and an important campus citizen. Indeed, it was Gene who made our School of Public Policy the Goldman School, persuading the Goldman family to make the gift that named the school and enabled it to build a second building. Gene epitomized the commitment to social justice, to analytic rigor, and to wise policymaking that define the school's mission. He also epitomized its spirit, wise, warm, welcoming, funny. I think about the living room in the old building where the community of the Goldman School gathers in formal and in informal ways. Gene, to me, symbolizes the spirit of that room. Gene was a mentor to me in the 1990s in my first term as provost. I just recall one anecdote. I was at a grand donor reception on the steps of Doe Library. We were either opening or closing a campaign, one or the other. And not yet used to these events, I was a little bit nervous. So someone introduced me to one of the generous benefactors there, and I put out my hand and said, "How nice to meet you." A few minutes later, Gene sidled up to me with his slightly rocking walk and said in my ear, "Never say, 'How nice to meet you.' Say, 'How nice to see you.'" I learned my lesson. He gave me lots of advice on issues both big and small, and I grew from it. In thinking about Gene since his death, the words of Auden's elegy for Yeats keep echoing in my mind. "You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all." In Gene's memory, I'm going to read another poem, this one by Mary Oliver, called "White Owl Flies Into and Out of the Field." Coming down out of the freezing sky with its depths of light, like an angel or a Buddha with wings, it was beautiful and accurate, striking the snow and whatever was there with a force that left the imprint of the tips of its wings 5 feet apart, and the grabbing thrust of its feet, and the indentation of what had been running through the white valleys of the snow. And then it rose gracefully and flew back to the frozen marshes to lurk there like a little lighthouse in the blue shadows. So I thought, maybe death isn't darkness after all, but so much light wrapping itself around us, as soft as feathers, that we are instantly weary of looking and looking, and shut our eyes not without amazement, and let ourselves be carried as through the translucence of mica to the river that is without the least dapple or shadow, that is nothing but light, scalding aortal light, in which we are washed and washed out of our bones. We'll miss you, Eugene.
Thank you, Carol, for those lovely remarks. Our next speaker is Sheldon Danziger. Sheldon and Geno began to work together at the University of Wisconsin around the mid-1970s, beginning a strong and fruitful collaboration as well as a personal friendship that continued for 50 years. In the first few years that Geno was at GSPP, he kept comparing in his mind his former life at the University of Wisconsin with his current life at Berkeley. And he kept saying to me, "You're Sheldon," meaning, I think, that I was the nice one who could be counted upon to do whatever needed to get done. Later, after Geno and I had established a pattern of having lunch together every day, he said I was Bert Weisbrod, a wonderful economist that Geno had lunch with every day at the University of Wisconsin. I didn't tell him that I considered that to be a demotion. Sheldon spent all yesterday traveling from New York to get here, and he will spend this evening on a red-eye because he must be back tomorrow. Sheldon, only you are Sheldon, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on Geno.
I wrote this out because I knew. I arrived in Madison for a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Wisconsin Institute for Research on Poverty. And I remember the day, not because you'll see why. It was August 8th, 1974, the day Nixon resigned. So I always remember the day I showed up. I had been a below-average doctoral student at MIT, unlike a speaker who will follow me, Matt Raven, who is more the typical MIT econ doctoral student. And I was finishing my dissertation on urban economics and income inequality. And I went to see Geno in September when faculty were back, because at the time he was an urban economist. And one of the things that was amazing about Geno was how many times his specialty evolved. He started as a macroeconomist, as a research assistant to the Nobel Prize winner Larry Klein when he got his PhD at Penn. Then he moved into economic history when he was at Haverford, and he had begun writing about urban economics and the post-Fisk distribution of income when I got to Madison, and that was lucky for me. People who know me, I've told this story many times. I gave him a dissertation chapter in those days. Young people won't remember, you only had a few copies because carbon paper you could make maybe 2 copies with carbon paper when you typed it out. And I gave it to Geno, and nobody had ever done this before. In fact, I'm not sure anybody even read my dissertation at MIT. It wasn't that interesting to them. But it came back cut and pasted onto a yellow pad. And there was a hole on the front page, and he said, "That's not an introduction, that's a conclusion. See the last page." And almost every page was marked up or cut up. What are you saying here? This is repetition. Tell me more about what this means. Just don't write about what the numbers are. So I rewrote the paper as he suggested, submitted it to a second-rate journal, and it was published. I am confident, and I've said this before, that I never would have gotten tenure anywhere. 2 lucky things. Bob Haveman and Irv Garfinkel hired me to be this postdoc when my alternative was an assistant professor somewhere, and I never would have had Geno's mentorship, and I would have washed out. So as the saying goes, that was the start of a beautiful relationship which evolved. I always considered him my mentor, but he then became colleague, co-author, and friend. I actually looked back at my CV, something I don't do very often these days. In fact, I stopped updating it years ago when I became foundation president. And Geno and I wrote about 20 papers together, some with Bob Haveman, some with Peter Gottschalk, one with Paul Smolensky, then an undergraduate at Harvard. And we should say, Geno was always concerned about a conflict of interest. Paul was not paid that summer with IRP funds, and I don't know whether Matt will talk about it, but one of the smartest research assistants I ever had was Matt Rabin when he was an undergrad math major at Wisconsin. Geno told me, you should hire this young man. I can't, because it would be a hot conflict of interest. The 70s and 80s were golden decades for the evidence-based, policy-relevant economic analyses that Geno valued, modeled in his research, teaching, and mentorship of dozens of students at Wisconsin and later at Berkeley. I can remember one incident, maybe it was his first public policy foray in the US. I know he had visited Yugoslavia. Paul probably went to Yugoslavia when Paul was still in the family home. But Geno had been working at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Carter administration on the Program for Better Jobs and Income, and was at a cocktail party somewhere with a counterpart from the Labor Department, and HEW wanted higher income guarantees, and the labor people wanted less for income guarantees and more for public jobs. And as I say, I wasn't there, but the argument was legendary. They didn't come to blows, but these days with polarization, maybe they would have. When Geno came back from Washington, he became director of the Institute for Research on Poverty in time to have the funding cut by the Reagan administration. But he worked very hard to keep it going, and it's still going today. And another director who didn't work as hard, it might have gone under. When he left for Berkeley, we still remained close, although as Lee said, I certainly didn't have anybody to consult with over lunch, but I've consulted with him on every major research and professional decision I've made over the last almost 50 years. He and Natalie were also family to my family. You'll know why I know this date. At 5 a.m. on January 10th, 1984, I raced to drop off our almost 3-year-old son at their house, ringing the doorbell, handing him to Geno, and rushed back to the hospital for the birth of our daughter. I actually think Jacob is the one who first called him Geno. He was born in 1981 and was talking by 1984. I may be wrong. I do know that Jacob is the one who called Haveman and Wolf Big Bob and Little Bobby, but they haven't picked that up, but Geno picked it up. Geno and Natalie were our children's third set of grandparents because they were in Madison when our children were small, and my parents and my wife's parents were not. And as I recall, Geno was the only one of the 6 grandparents to attend both their weddings. Geno wasn't a narrow economist. He read widely and loved paintings, as somebody mentioned at this morning's memorial. At Wisconsin, he and a colleague, Everett Cassellow, attended audited art history courses. When we were at conferences, especially if they were in Europe, he insisted on a museum visit. And unlike Bobby, who went along willingly, I went along because Geno was my friend and mentor. And I can remember him spending more time than I was interested in explaining the progression of color and perspective, evident at least to him in over 100 years of paintings of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. As we walked through the gallery, he'd say, see? When are we getting out of here? I learned several important lessons from Geno, many over lunch. And I know he continued that practice at Berkeley and how hard it was when the pandemic canceled those lunches. So here are the lessons that I learned from Geno that I have tried to pass on, because I think they're very wise for people in academia. One, work with your graduate students and junior colleagues and share authorship credit with them. Your research methods are going to get rusty quicker than you want. Their recent training means they are not rusty. Always respect what criticisms you will get from your junior co-authors. Two, make junior co-authors the first author. Early in our collaboration, I turned in a draft on yellow paper listed as Smolensky and Danziger. He reversed it and said, "The marginal benefit to you of this paper at this point in your career is much greater than the marginal benefit to me." And he reported with glee about 30 years later. He had gone on I think he was doing World Bank work. I forget where he was, somewhere in Europe, it may have been Israel. And somebody came up to him and saw his age, he was probably 70, and said, "Oh, I remember reading Danziger and Smolensky. Is he still alive?" And so, right, that's Geno. He came back roaring. "See, that's why I made you first author." Lesson number 3, mentoring extends your legacy. When people stop reading my publications, they will read those of my doctoral students and younger collaborators. How true that is. Nobody reads what Geno wrote anymore, but they still read what Steve Raphael wrote. And Geno, as soon as Steve was on the market, was telling me, this is a smart young economist. Nobody reads what I write anymore, but they read what Rucker Johnson wrote. And I'm proud that I followed Geno in mentoring, so that's something I remember. Lesson number 4, if you would rather teach an undergraduate course than a doctoral course because you haven't kept up with the latest research, it's time to take an administrative job. He told me that when he was going to Berkeley, and I said, "Why are you going to Berkeley and breaking up this wonderful relationship we have?" And I told him the same thing in 2013 when I asked him to nominate me for the Russell Sage presidency. He said, "Why do you want to be Russell Sage president?" I said, "You told me I like undergraduate teaching more now." But I also know that he loved teaching the Berkeley doctoral seminar when he retired. And I think he may have reluctantly turned it over to Hillary when she came back. And he was totally devoted to a new generation of students. And there were a number of students who he would say, "Here, you should read this paper and give them comments because you're more up on this topic than I am." Lesson number 5, and this has come out again, when you take an administration, do what is best for the institution, not what is best for you. As chair of the economics department in Wisconsin, as director of the Institute for Research on Poverty, as dean of the Goldman School, and as trustee of the Russell Sage Foundation. In each of these positions, he worked relentlessly to do what was needed, to hire new faculty, raise funds, here to build a building, and work to achieve a consensus. I first observed him when he was chair of economics, and he told me this was an important thing to do, and I've tried to model it. He walked the halls and talked with colleagues to get their views before what he knew would be a difficult decision, and had to craft a consensus. He also told me that when he was at Haverford, which had the Quaker tradition of not being able to resolve an issue without consensus, that he gave his view in the first 15 minutes and left 15 minutes before the meeting ended so that they could achieve consensus without him being there. So Geno's lessons, his sage advice, his warm friendship, and his Borscht Belt humor were an important part of my career and life from August 74 until December 23. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon. Those are wonderful remarks. Steve Raphael is our next speaker. Steve joined the GSPP faculty in 1999, just after Geno had completed his second term as dean and returned to the professoriate. What was very senior Professor Geno like to our new incoming assistant professor? I hope that we get some insight into that from Steve's reflections on Geno's many contributions to us.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And just to correct the record, I'm not the above-average person from MIT. I'm another below-average graduate student. Geno collected us. So it wasn't until I became a father that I began to hear the voices of my own parents and the things that I would say to my own children. Sometimes I'd find this shocking, but mostly I would find comfort in the continuity and the awareness that my many years with the people who cared for me prepared me for life's most important responsibilities. It was always a profound revelation to me about the impact that key people in our lives have on us during our most formative years. I was absolutely blessed to have been taken under Geno's wing very early in my career. I met Geno my third year in graduate school at UC Berkeley when he was, I believe, at the end of his first term at the dean at Goldman, and I worked for him as an RA for 3 years for the remainder of my graduate studies. I left Berkeley for a bit after graduating for my first academic appointment, and then was back as assistant professor at Goldman, probably due in large part to Geno advocating for me, though he never told me so. Graduate school and academia for me, more generally, were uncharted territories. Nobody in my family had ever been to college, and it really was just kind of a blank slate where I really didn't know what I was doing in many ways. And Geno was my saving grace. He not only showed me the ropes, but instilled me a strong sense of what's important, what isn't, how to treat people and be supportive, how to be honest in your writing and your teaching, and how to be a responsible and good citizen at your institution. It goes without saying that Geno was a fantastic and generous mentor to many. He didn't care about pedigree. He erred on the side of including people and exhibited great loyalty to his students and mentees. He was very much a first principles, follow the data and be honest policy scholar, had little tolerance for bending evidence to fit political positions, but also strongly believed in the public responsibility to bolster the welfare of the least well-off. He cared about the people around him, would frequently ask about your family, knew and loved everybody's kids, and your kids loved him, and was generally interested in what was happening in your life outside of work. He also talked frequently of his family. His wife, Natalie, who was his adored life partner and who left us too early, his children, Paul and Beth, his grandson, Josh, of whom he was particularly proud. I feel like I've seen pictures of you for the last 30 years. It's the first time I've seen Paul in person. And of course, Matt. And he reveled in their lives and their accomplishments. He loved his family. He was super close to his staff at Goldman, with whom he had lifelong friendships until the end of his life. He was also the person to speak to when you had difficult decisions to make and regularly exercised Solomonic judgment in his guidance of the school. Geno was incredibly and wickedly funny. I was trying to think of many of the spontaneous one-liners that would just sort of emanate from Geno on a regular basis, and I couldn't pare down the list, but I chose a few just over the cover that I thought were really funny. When I told him when I was an assistant professor that I was appointed to the Berkeley Committee on Research, an assignment that mainly involved giving very small grants to faculty members at Berkeley, Geno said, quote, "There's no stronger validation of microeconomic theory than watching academics fight over $1,000. Right before I went on the market, I tried to clean up, become more presentable, got a haircut, bought a suit. And I bumped into Geno in Evans Hall. I was walking into a mock interview. And I looked at him and said, "Hey, do you know how I look?" And his response was, "Well, now all you need to do is take care of that fixed effect." Which if you're not an economist, my mother to this day still says to each of her 5 kids when somebody's getting too big for their station, you can dress a monkey in silk, but it's still a monkey. It's the same thing, but just the economics version. I mean, just as a final anecdote, I was visiting Geno in the hospital, and Eric was there, and Paul was there, and he was very hungry. He was not feeling well, and he hadn't eaten for a couple days, and he wanted soup. And the nurse was fussing over this soup, got some that was sort of okay for him to have on his restricted diet. She was heating it up, and then it was too hot, it was getting cold, and it was too cold, and this kind of was going on for a while. And Geno turned to me and looked at me with this typical Geno expression where his eyes would open and his eyebrows were a little furrowed, and he sighed. And it was kind of this patient exasperation that he would have with his graduate students when you said something silly, right? And he'd listen. And the nurse finally thought it was the right temperature, gave a little Geno and asked, is it good, Geno? And Geno said, no, but it's not too hot. And Eric looked at me and said, there he is. This was just a couple weeks ago. So I'm incredibly grateful for the role that Geno played in my life, and I know that I'm not the only one of many who feel this way. Nearly 30 years into my career and having much broader responsibilities than those I had as a young man, I often hear Geno's voice in the words coming out of my mouth. There's not a day that goes by where I don't draw upon the lessons that I learned from him in both my professional and personal life, and I'm sure that many here feel the same. His impact on his many students, colleagues, and coworkers is immeasurable, and he made an indelible impact on UC Berkeley and the Goldman School and on many people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Tom Goldstein is our next speaker. Tom and Geno became UC Berkeley deans at about the same time, each of a small professional school in our large university. They had much in common as they were figuring out how to navigate their respective ships in the sometimes difficult waters of the larger university. I think they helped each other, and over this experience, bonded to become fast friends. Tom, what would you like to tell us about Geno?
Thank you, Lee. As Lee noted, we started together, even though, there's some dispute as to who started first. And it's important because we were the first two deans named by Judd King, and we had great fortune in working for him. I will concede that Gene started, I think, a week earlier in the summer of 1988. I confess, I had never heard of him, and I doubt that he had ever heard of me. But we had so much in common in those early years, that we forged a lifetime connection. I was the third dean in the history of the Graduate School of Journalism, and as you've heard, Gene was the third dean in the history of GSPP, following Aaron Wildofsky, the founding dean, and Alan Sindler. As it turned out, Gene lasted a bit longer as dean than I did, but not too much longer. The two schools were mostly graduate schools. We had that in common. They were small, particularly for Berkeley, about the same size in terms of faculty and in terms of the size of the student body, a bit under 100 at the time. The two schools were geographically close, a couple of blocks away on Hearst. We were almost next-door neighbors. Back then, many small parking lots dotted that part of campus, including one immediately in front of the journalism school and another in front of the public policy school. Each morning, there was competition to score a prime parking space. Gene and I were early risers, which enabled us to get such spaces most of the time. More often than you might think, Gene and I met in one parking lot or another and discussed business, which in our case meant mostly personnel. We each had inherited staff members and academic colleagues who at times led us to brag and at other times to commiserate. My life got much better once I hired Gene's wife, the incomparable Natalie, to help run the journalism school. Gene and I also shared our good fortune not only in being hired by Judd, but then working for Carol Christ once Judd left. We learned from our bosses and we learned from each other. And he was a good citizen and a good friend. I remember him co-teaching a freshman seminar in journalism. Why? Because of his great interest in journalism? No, because he knew I had a problem and he wanted to be helpful. Another time, he co-taught a challenging lecture course in media studies. Why? Because I asked. It was wonderful to have him as a colleague. And it was a treat to be in the same classroom as he was. I really enjoyed listening to him. He was well prepared, well informed, and relaxed, and he tried to tell jokes. He understood how a major university worked and was generous in his advice and time. He happily did what others asked of him. On the university-wide basis, he ran 2 key searches, one for the dean of the law school, the second for the library school, which lasted a bit longer than was expected as that school became reconstituted as the information school. Toward the end of his teaching career, he received the coveted Berkeley citation. I remember the 2003 ceremony where he got the citation, but I cannot tell you much more about that singular honor. Neither the colleagues I asked nor I could locate a copy of it. Any evidence of its specific language was vanished, which is a shame. So let me make a modest suggestion here. Perhaps there can be somewhere on campus an easily accessible place to find old Berkeley citations should exist. Gene was a mensch, someone you like a lot and admire, a trusted, reliable friend you can count on. As I've said, he was kind, funny, smart, generous, and spontaneous. He loved to drink, eat food, and joke. He could not resist a joke, jokes that were funny and jokes that made you groan. He did not discriminate. He loved to reminisce about his days in the Borscht Belt, his preferred source of humor. Gene adored his family and was proud of his students, and he let you know that. He was wise and anything but an academic politician. He said aloud what he thought privately, no filter. He cared mostly about doing good work for himself and those close to him. What stood out was he was not overtly ambitious. However, he certainly did have a competitive streak. I learned that, to my surprise and sorrow, after playing squash with him a couple of times. He demolished me. He was ambidextrous, something he was very proud of, but didn't brag about. In the few minutes I have left, I'm going to relate an anecdote that shines a light on Gene. One of the cardinal rules I have learned as a journalist is that names make news. I'm going to violate that rule here and leave names out. I want to talk about Gene's fierce loyalty and collegiality. But first, I want to go back half a century now to a story about a partner in a major Wall Street law firm. The partner got in trouble. He was accused of embezzling funds from the firm. He had not been caught before this because he had never taken a vacation. Ultimately, he took some time off, and he was in fact caught. The very day that story broke, the managing partner of that firm took his fallen colleague out to lunch in the most public place he could find. Why do that? The manager was asked. Because he was my partner, he replied. He was not endorsing embezzlement, he was embracing loyalty. Fast forward a couple of decades. A colleague of Gene's got himself in an unpleasant scrape, which received its share of publicity. Gene's immediate instinct, after scolding his colleague in private, was to find the most visible place available and take him out to lunch. Gene understood that people were flawed and that perfection was not achievable. A good dean should be supportive of his faculty while simultaneously serving as a role model. That was Gene's lasting gift of leadership. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom, for those wonderful memories and anecdotes and insights. Our next speaker is Matt Rabin. Matt, as a freshly minted PhD, joined the faculty of the Berkeley Economics Department in 1989, almost the same time that his uncle, Geno Smolensky, joined Berkeley to become dean of the Public Policy School. Matt remained for about 25 years at Berkeley before he left to join the faculty at Harvard. I heard a lot about Matt during those 25 years. Recall, Geno and I had lunch together almost every day. And Matt, from Geno's perspective, it was all good. What was it like from Matt's perspective? Well, perhaps we'll find out right now.
Okay, well, thank you, and I can only thank you, as I know other family members do, for how many great friends he had, and I think we're learning why he may have deserved that. But so I think I provide something of a different perspective than others have. My guess is that I met Geno in 1964. But I don't know. I was born at the end of 1963. I was left speechless the first time I met him. So I was born in 63, and by the end of the 60s, I could talk. And so I first knew him variously as Uncle Gene or Mr. Tickle. So, which I am guessing and hoping none of the rest of you knew him as. Okay. So I was working in food service when I first arrived at University of Wisconsin. So, you know, the 70s are a blur to me, but in 1981 I arrived as an undergraduate at Wisconsin. And I was first working at food service. Gene and Natalie were incredibly kind to me in so many ways. It was great to have family. And at the time, I was a vegan and libertarian. And at the food service, as I argued with my manager, they were subsidizing the meat with the vegetables because everyone needed their meat. And so I believed in the free market and in animal rights. That was hard. I tried to start a student group, Vegans for Reagan, but you needed 3 people to form a student group. So, and then Geno rescued me from that job to do something that was more fulfilling and less soul-rotting than scraping meat off grills. And then started my long episode of literal nepotism. So Sheldon reminded me that Sheldon was my supervisor, so as to not be corrupt. We didn't try very hard to hide it, so he was pretty open about it. And he also got me a summer job, consulting firm. I was paid, by the way, so Paul, somebody owes you money. So he helped me get the summer consulting job. I worked at the Poverty Institute for a couple of years. I graduated in December of '84, I think, and then he lined up. I did a visiting position at LSE before grad school, working with Jolene Legrand, a friend of his, and the benefit of my relationship to him lasted well beyond that, on top of having access to his wisdom just often and in my first day at MIT graduate school, Geno had just talked to Peter Diamond on the phone, told him about me, and Peter said that Geno was the funniest economist he knew, which put pressure on me as well. And I don't know the disappointment he felt. Peter clearly never found me funny, so what are you going to do? So I want to come back a little bit to his love of family and the nepotism part, because it's something I grapple with a bit. He was also a model teacher and advisor. People have talked about. When I visited Haverford, which I believe was like 55 years after he had left or something, I found in an alumni newsletter somebody mentioning him by name, that they didn't want to major in economics, but none of their first three choices were majors there. So, but the person had taken a course with Eugene Smolensky, and based on that, decided to major in economics. Geno once told me his great technique, he claimed, for getting great teacher evaluations, which is the last day of class, just tell the students how great the course was. So that's always intrigued me as now he didn't do proper identification, didn't work for me. I suspect that's something to do with how great a teacher he was, rather than his scheme. And he has just been so good, I think, to so many people. You've heard a lot about the advising. He's always amazed me that way. We had some students that we each advised to some extent. A few are in this room. And it was always embarrassing how much harder Geno worked and how much more generous with his time he was. He has this peculiar economist ego thing, which is they hide how nice they are, because I don't know, it's you get in trouble for being too nice as an economist. But so it took me a while to figure out just how much he was doing for people. Presumably for me too, as an undergraduate. And then I want to talk a bit about, which people have covered, the part of his advising, the great way he was advisor for students, is I think he loved ideas, and that included loving other people's ideas. And I think this is part of being a dean, the fact that he could be interdisciplinary, but also, it's something I advise my students, that maybe they don't want to do this. If they don't have the experience of going to a seminar and hearing interesting stuff by somebody who doesn't work in their area, not citing them and so forth, and just coming away feeling like you learned something, that's part of the passion you should have. So I think as an advisor and as a dean, and he was able to sort of support other people's research, which I do think was a passion of his, and I think a great glue that holds academia together. He also, I think, was pretty good at a notion of I'm not going to pronounce words right. An eclectic view of what good research is. I mean, he was an economist to the core in some ways, but he was also wanted people to see the merit in other people's research. I remember how much he would get frustrated with theorists fighting with empiricists, saying, "Oh, I could do what they're doing so much better." Hidden behind the term that economists use of comparative advantage, when so as they don't have to admit they have an absolute disadvantage in some of these cases. But he would scold, "No, you couldn't do what they're doing. You couldn't do what they're doing." The problem is more severe among theorists who thought if you were any good at trisecting angles or whatever, you wouldn't be pissing away your life in some African village or alleviating poverty or so forth. So I don't think there was a symmetry in amount of arrogance in these sort of fights. But he also did something else which I admired. I think this came up a little, which is he wasn't a crank about the new way that people were doing research. He admired all the progress in empirical work. He would talk about how when he went to job market talks in recent decades, how much better these students are than back in his day. And so whereas a lot of us, well, some of us were born cranky, like at a very young age, but instead of saying, "Oh, these days they're only worried about technical things and they're not interested in the big picture," I think he appreciated all the progress that is being made. And that's not always so common or so easy for us academics as we age. And then what I've only learned over time is just how much of a good economist he was. I sort of appreciated that, but I find myself quoting him more and more often, noticing how much I quote some of his insights and some of his arguments. Quite often, I quote my dear Aunt Natalie probably at least once a day to my students, always with the same quote, that I can't tell you what to do, I can only tell you what's right. And I have tried that on students when I sort of give up. And Geno has similar exchanges where he relies on the intelligence of advisees and students to, he's going to give his perspective, and then you invite people to push back and to not agree with you, and that's the way you get good ideas going. Finally, I do want to note how really passionate he was about sort of improving the world and helping especially the disadvantaged and encouraging diversity. This is both in what he studied, obviously sort of poverty, and also in the way he encouraged people within the profession. Sort of before it was as popular, as it's the wrong term, as it should be, he was encouraging diverse voices, often very quietly, often with not quite the right vocabulary, so some of it a bit dated. But, I mean, he was really doing something. He wanted people from different backgrounds to be able to participate in academia. I didn't know Steve, was the first in his family to go to college, but I know other instances. I believe Geno was the first in his family, certainly, to go to college. And but to encourage that much, to try to make both the study engage with the people who need the most help in the world, and to try to be more inclusive in research. How am I going to reconcile this with how good he was to family and the extreme privilege I got, the advantages I got from that connection? I'm not going to reconcile it. So I've gotten in fights with people recently who say there's this big tension between those who have a universalist ethic and those who more sort of sectarian and local, and that you can be both. You spend enough time being generous. You can be very generous to those closest to you and to your family, and also very inclusive in an attempt to help those who don't have your advantage. That doesn't entirely, I think we have difficulty. I've often sort of think about my privilege these days on such things, and, reading like Robert Frank on just how unable so we are to think of the role that luck played in our lives, and to think our success is all due to us. And among academia, I think often the luck we refuse to acknowledge is that if we're born with capabilities, that's also luck, and that doesn't make us necessarily deserving of more resources. And people like Raj Chetty and so forth are just sort of studying, trying to find out just how much advantage there is in those with a good background. And I've reflected on that a lot while I spend time just, it's very salient to me, all the advantages I got from his wisdom and his attempts to help, and finding mechanisms to sort of extend that more broadly, I think, is an important thing. So I think I'll stop there. So.
Thank you, Matt. Not only a great family, but a great academic family. Jalila Labrie is our next speaker. One reason why GSPP has such great students is Jalila. For more than 20 years, she has been helping them with everything from applying, orienting the new incoming students, advising them, arranging their graduation events. In short, helping to make GSPP be a welcoming, happy, and productive place that students seek out. Geno and Jalila interacted in numerous ways, and we look forward to learning more about Geno from Jalila's perspective. Jalila.
Good afternoon, everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, I worked with Geno for the past 20 years at the Goldman School of Public Policy. And for those of you who do know me, what you may not know is Geno is the reason why I'm at the Goldman School. So my first job at UC Berkeley was at the School of Journalism. And I worked with Geno's wife, Natalie, who was a wonderful person, the kindest woman I've ever met. And Geno would come by to the school from time to time to visit his wife, and then that's how I got to know him. And he was always a blast. So I left the journalism school a couple of years later, relocated, came right back. And I guess word got out that I was back in the area. And there was an opening at the policy school, and Geno thought of me, reached out to me, and I've been here ever since. So I have many fond memories of Geno. We spent a lot of time together. But there are a couple things that stand out the most. The first would be our long talks in our offices. We would talk about everything, just life, politics, our families. He was, it was no question that his grandson was the light of his life. He talked about him the most. The second thing I remember the most is our lunches. So Geno and I worked closely together in admissions. I was director of admissions at the time, and he was chair of admissions for several years. And we also were reading partners once. That was fun. So we started this tradition where after we got through every cycle of admissions, which could be gruesome, we would reward and celebrate our getting through the cycle with a fancy lunch. And so I think the first year was just he and I, and then we started inviting others, and it became with me, Geno, Steve Raphael, Professor John Elwood, and Cecile, my colleague, who also works at the Goldman School. And before you know it, we were doing it. It was like it became a regular thing, even when I wasn't even working in admissions anymore. We just became lunch partners. And the best thing about these lunches, outside of Geno's delightful company, was the food. Geno introduced me to really good food. And he introduced me to really good cocktails. And some of my favorite restaurants to this day are ones that he introduced me to. The last year, I tried to schedule another lunch because I knew it might be the last. It didn't happen, but I will always cherish our time together. Geno he was fun, he was funny, he always had me laughing. He was brilliant, he was caring, and he was just a really good person. And I will miss him dearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jalila. Our next speaker is Eric Evenhouse. Eric received his PhD in economics from Berkeley, and as a graduate student worked as a research assistant for Geno. This was a good match, as those two went on to collaborate and to co-author a number of articles together during the 1990s, as well as to become good friends. Eric and I were visiting Geno in the hospital on the same day, shortly before he passed. His condition impaired his speech at the time, so he was difficult to understand. And while we were there to comfort him, we both knew perfectly well that he kept cracking jokes in order to comfort us. That was Geno. And Eric, we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us about Geno.
All right, well, I have to write my remarks because I know it's hard for me to get through this, but the first thing I would say is I'm glad he's not here to watch me do public speaking. Because I think he's only ever watched me one time before, and it was the first time I presented any research to a group of students at Berkeley, and afterward he told me two things. He said, I'm going to sew your pocket shut next time, and you have a persona to acquire. So it's like, we all know Geno. I had no response, of course, but those words stuck with me. So my path first crossed with Geno's when I came to grad school in fall of '89. I'd been a research assistant for Millard Long at the World Bank for a year. Some of you may know Millard, who was a friend of his from his Chicago days. Millard, when I left for DC, Millard made me promise I would get in touch with Geno. So of course I said I would. I had zero intention of following up. But Geno reached out to me. The first few weeks into the semester, I got a phone call out of the blue, and it was Geno, and he was like shouting down the line, "Where are you? Millard said you'd be coming to see me." So that summons made a lasting impression on me. And then the next day I did go up to meet him, and those first 30 seconds of meeting him made a lasting impression because he was more like one of the Three Stooges than like a dean. We met up in the living room of the old GSPP. He tried to sit down on one of the low couches. He missed it. He fell on the floor. And so I didn't laugh. But then he just acted as though that pratfall had been deliberate. And he stayed there, and he introduced himself from the floor. So, and, that was true Geno style. For me, it was just a moment of classic Geno theater. For him, it was just routine. I mean, even a few years later, he had no recall of the details of that meeting. So as a grad student, I was fortunate to be one of his research assistants for the first few years while I was there. I like to take some credit for pointing him at Steve, because when he told me I was being fired because I needed to work on my own dissertation in order to get out of Berkeley, he didn't listen to advice we gave him about the first person he hired. And so then he asked us again, and we said, "Steve." And things worked out for Geno and Steve, I hope. But while I was working for him, I often thought, surely he couldn't be getting nearly as much out of that relationship as I was. And I knew that I was very lucky the day that Millard had connected me to Geno, and I still feel that way today. So after graduating, at first, I saw him maybe 3 or 4 times a year, and usually that would be when Millard Long was in town. But our friendship became deeper starting about a decade ago, when he and I started to have lunch basically every 2 weeks, and that was a very fixed rhythm for us both. And I soon learned a lot about him, little snippets that I'd heard before. Now I heard the whole story, or I heard the story many times. But one thing I learned was that for a person who was so obsessed with food and had so many food-related stories, he was incredibly risk-averse. We'd go to those same restaurants that he liked, and he would never try anything new. He'd study the menu just in case they had something new, and then he'd order the same thing as always. If you tell me the restaurant, I'll tell you what he's going to order. I also quickly learned that he was feigning forgetfulness every time he insisted that it must be his turn to pay again. Because I realized he never forgets anything, and I know that he scrutinizes that monthly visa statement the way my mother still scrutinizes hers. I also learned that he loved dessert, and I think most of the time when he was setting aside half of his entree, saying he was going to eat it tomorrow at home, it was just to make sure that we ordered dessert, that we could share dessert, because I also know that he nearly always threw away whatever he took home from the restaurant. I also learned how much he hated vegetables. If there was something green on his plate, he would not eat it. And it was almost a point of pride with him. He made me laugh a couple years ago when he was shopping for a new doctor, because the very top item on his list for the criteria this new doctor had to meet was he had to see what the doctor said when he told him, "Whatever you tell me about diet, I'm going to ignore it." And so the man who passed just said, "Got it." So for him, the guy had to be a good doctor. Another subject we talked a lot about was Natalie. My own sister-in-law died of ALS 3 years ago, and she was local. And while she was ill, Geno asked about her every single time. And I think not just because he keeps track of what's going on in all of our lives, but he also welcomed the chance to talk about Natalie, not just about those difficult years of her illness and death, but about their whole life together, and a lot about the years they never got together. And I can't possibly remember all the stories Geno shared about his life. Growing up in Brooklyn, working for relatives in the Army surplus stores, his original plan to major in creative writing and become a novelist. I'm sure he would have been hilarious. Delivering milk with his father early in the mornings, meeting Natalie, being in the Navy, being at the NSA, going back to school on the GI Bill, life in Wisconsin, all the ways it sucked being a dean, and a zillion trips for conferences. And of course, as we've already heard from Bobby this morning, those conference trips always involved restaurants and food. He remembers what he ate at each restaurant. How it amazed me. I often tried to get him to talk about his childhood rather than the conferences because I'd heard about those. His childhood was what was interesting for me, and just a few examples from those stories. His first wages, he said, were running down Brooklyn streets with little paper sacks of cash. He was carrying them to the backroom betting shop, the upstairs wire room, as he called it. He didn't know what it was for, but he knew it was a wire room. He said he liked to hang around his favorite auntie, who probably many of you have heard about. But one thing he liked was hanging around her apartment when she had her weekly poker game, because invariably one of her lady friends would hand him $1 and ask him to go get her a pack of cigarettes, and he could keep the change. And so back then a pack of cigarettes was 20 cents. And one of the things that struck me was that one of his early jobs was when he was in the summering in the Catskills. So as a young man, I imagined high school or college maybe. He got paid to be available, be on standby at the dance floor, because so many husbands worked in the city during the week, but their wives still wanted to dance at night. And so he told me, he said, I was a really good dancer. I knew all the popular dances, and he listed them all, and I was impressed. I'd tried social dancing. I found it hard to learn. And he was a little put out that I seemed so surprised to hear him telling me what a good dancer he had been. And there was a period when he reminisced a lot about the Catskills, actually, and not surprisingly, it's when he was watching that TV show, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and he talked a lot about all the stand-up comics that came through, and we know he loves comedy. His love of comedy and his talent for comedy is a good place for me to stop. So many of my favorite moments are of Geno, moments when he made me laugh, made other people laugh, and I'm sorry I won't have any more of those moments, and I'm grateful for all the ones I did have. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Our next speaker is Joe Castro. One of Geno's most brilliant moves as GSPP Dean was to hire Joe Castro to be our assistant dean. This was at a time when the smaller GSPP had only one assistant dean. Joe was a GSPP alum who had spent several years working for the state legislature and wanted to develop a career in higher education with special emphasis on increasing access and value for underrepresented students. It was Joe's idea to have GSPP apply for state funding under a seismic strengthening program for public buildings, and that was successful and helped to make our original building safe, as well as to expand it with several new offices. Geno encouraged Joe to obtain his PhD in education and to go on in educational administration, and they remained fast friends. Joe, please tell us what you'd like to about Geno.
Thank you, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by expressing my deepest condolences to Geno's family. And thank you for allowing me a few minutes to share just a couple of thoughts about how Geno affected my life in so many positive ways. Geno was many things to me. since we first met in 1988. He was a newly appointed dean, as you heard from Dean Goldstein, and that happened right as I was coming into GSPP as an MPP student. Until I met Geno, I had never had a relationship as a student with a dean. I had never even really knew what a dean did, and it was completely foreign to me. But what I found out very quickly is Geno was everywhere. He was in the living room of our old building between breaks when we come out of the blue room from classes. He'd be chatting with us, laughing with us, and then he would teach us in the classroom. And I know he did that with Gene Bardak and in other ways as well. And then even at lunchtime, he'd come over to us at restaurants and he would start making jokes. So that was kind of my introduction as a student to Geno. During that magical 2 years for me as a student at GSPP, his door was always open to me, and I would imagine was open to all students, but I certainly felt that way with him. And at key times, he offered me really very helpful advice while consistently making me laugh. The interactions were incredible, as other people have described. I went to him one time because I was trying to decide between, basically at the early stages of my thinking about a career, I was interested in two policy areas, and I told them what they were. And he said, "Your community needs you in higher education. You should do that." And that ended up being excellent advice. In 1993, as Lee said, Geno called me unexpectedly. I was working in Sacramento, enjoying that work, and he said, "Would you be interested in serving as assistant dean of the GSPP?" Well, I hadn't even thought about that, but it turned out to be a pretty easy yes because of my deep respect for him and my love for GSPP. And working with Geno for 4 years was among the most enjoyable periods of my professional life. Our conversations alternated from serious to joking. He had a gentle way of letting me know when he wanted me to do something differently. I remember early in my time working with him, he said to me, "I'd like you to help me build more community within GSPP." So Cecile and I and others started planning more events for students and faculty and staff to get together, and he always came to those events. It was wonderful. And one day he put his arm around me and he said, "I love all those events that I asked you to plan, but Joe, we are spending a lot of money on wine and cheese." And he laughed, and that was his gentle message of telling me to take my foot off the brake, which I did. His gentle message was received. As a dean, Geno enjoyed a very strong partnership with Provost Judd King, another incredible leader like Chancellor Christ, and he could not be here today. He wanted to come, but he could not be here today. He was generous to share this comment about Geno. He said, "Geno was my first dean appointment." I'm sorry, Dean Goldstein. "Early on in my tenure as provost for professional schools and colleges, I greatly admired him as someone who knew just the right ways of dealing with people and using his fine and yet unusual sense of humor so effectively. He was a good and very supportive friend." End quote. I also invited just a few close friends who were GSPP alumni, mostly around the time I was either a student or served as assistant dean. I wanted to share a few examples of what they shared with me. They remember Geno for his accessibility, his excellent teaching skills, his strong commitment to strengthening the GSPP, and his lectures about the difference between advocacy and analysis. One of our alums really remembers that, seared in his head. Another alumnus said that, who went on to become an influential policy analyst in Sacramento, said that Geno spent some of his very precious time traveling to Sacramento to help him on a very time-sensitive policy matter that was very important to California. That was Geno. Geno and I stayed in pretty close touch throughout the years. I wish I could have seen him more. We would see each other sporadically. We'd email each other. We'd call each other. In spring of 2022, we were all set to visit in person. I was really excited. I was coming up here for a couple of meetings, and I was going to go to his house in Berkeley. And the pandemic was still around, causing problems. And after we had scheduled the time and I was ready to fly in, and he sends me this note. He said, this is in a way that only Geno could put it. He said, "Joe, I'm dying to see you, but I don't want to die by seeing you. So let's meet by Zoom." When I learned from Henry Brady last December, it was a message that Cecile sent me that Geno was at a hospital in Oakland. I had been dealing with my mother, who also passed away in December, and I had this one day where I could be here. It was December the 18th, but I was too late to see Geno in person. I went to the hospital, and the lady looked at me and said, "I recognize the name, but I don't see him here," and my heart sunk. And then I contacted Henry, and I was clearly too late. But as I sat in the lobby frustrated and tears in my eyes, I could not help but think that Geno was probably cracking a great joke, that, "Joe, you were a day too late to see me." Geno, thank you for your friendship and mentorship. Hasta luego.
Thank you, Joe. Our final speaker for today is Rob Letzler. Rob received his PhD from GSPP, and while he was a graduate student, he attended the PhD seminar taught by Geno. I think Geno was emeritus at the time, but he still wanted to do some teaching and was very interested in the futures of our PhD students. Let me turn the floor over to Rob so we can hear what it was like for him to know Geno.
So Lee set me up exactly right. Others have told you about Geno's fantastic accomplishments during the height of his career. I'm here to tell you about his master class in retirement. So at the end of his first year at GSPP, end of my first year at GSPP, he retired. And what he took that to mean was he stopped doing everything that annoyed him, realized that this was greatly liberating, and showed up in his office every morning to do the things he found meaningful. And write papers on art history, and fortunately for us, be very good to the PhD students. At this point, there were 39 dissertations already on the shelf in his office. It was very, very clear that he was proud of them. And at one point, I remember an email from him about what was the agenda for this coming week's PhD seminar, and the answer was, "We are helping Karen." One day he walked into the PhD seminar at the end of the semester and said, "I'm 76 years old. There's not much they can do to me, but you have to fill out the course evaluations anyway." At one point he declared that I would be his last dissertation student, and on that front he was wrong. There were more, including a friend of mine from the University of Chicago, who needed a little help. So it's both simultaneously fitting and very challenging to tell stories in honor of Geno because he was such a good storyteller. And it just reminds me of one of the fundamental challenges of being a PhD student. It's tempting to never start writing. There's always another article to think about, another way to slice the data, another conceptual framework to try, and you never quite feel like you're ready. And Geno had very clear advice on this. The first thing to do to write the dissertation is to write the dissertation. Write down everything that you know, and you'll be surprised by how much, and then you'll see where the holes are and what needs to be fixed and what needs to be fearlessly thrown out and redone. So he told many stories. I'll try to follow that wisdom today. He had many stories, and I think one of the running themes was that great researchers who are very productive were a very differentiated group of complicated and flawed people, and they were successful because they were self-aware and had come up with strategies to work through them, and that we needed to as well. He was very proud of a seminar he ran at Wisconsin, I believe, that he referred to as Feet of Clay. He brought in eminent scholars to present work that in a few months would be finished and airtight and impressive and ready to go, but was at the moment none of those things. So to reassure his doctoral students and junior scholars that their work, that was also none of those things, had a chance of being good enough eventually. He also ruefully once told the story of a time that he asked one of the most productive scholars around to give a talk about getting over writer's block, and got instead a seminar on how to write on trains and in airport terminals. So the final stage of finishing a PhD at Berkeley is surprisingly anticlimactic. You get your committee to sign a signature page. And so Geno, who at the time was writing papers in art history, was not technically on my dissertation committee about energy economics. So I inserted a page after the official signature page reading another dissertation signed by Geno. Central Campus had no sense of humor about this. But it's very much my personal copy. So in 2021, I reconnected with Geno. And we started Zooming and told stories about what we were up to, laughed at the absurdities of the world, gave updates on family, and of course, got sort of back into him mentoring on me on my anemic side projects in being an academic, despite the day job as a bureaucrat, and he's definitely helped me improve how I talk about the project, one of my projects right now. And then one day I got this email from him, and he said, "I'm going to the hospital, waiting surgery, nothing life-threatening, but I don't know when we'll be able to talk again." Then I actually connect with him a few days later, and he's in the hospital. Nurse drops by in mid-Zoom and says, "You're doing wonderfully for your age." And Geno says, "Yeah, wonderfully for a 90-year-old, terrible for an 89-year-old. and then things go silent for a while, and I start freaking out, and something terrible happened. And I get from Geno one sentence. "Rob, if you send me the complete draft of that paper you're working on, it will speed my recovery greatly."
Thank you, Rob, and many thanks to our speakers for a wonderful program and to everyone for being a part of this memorial. This concludes our formal program. We adjourn now to mingle over refreshments in the back, to greet those we know, to meet those we'd like to know, and to share more memories of Geno. Thank you, everybody.